Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining our webinar, Lessons for Success in the Age of Trump. I'm Will Coley, Communications Coordinator at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'm moderating today's webinar. So if you don't all know already, the Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds towards lasting policy and culture change. So if you're like me, every day it seems like there's a lot of negative news everywhere you look, things that seem to be undermining social justice, and very few reasons to be optimistic. I mean, we have had wins on healthcare so far, and the Muslim ban has been stopped on various occasions. But as an organization, we've been paying attention to what's happening at the local level. It seems that at the state and local level, there's a lot more interesting and inspiring stuff that's happening. And that's what we wanted to talk to you about today on the call and on the webinar. We're joined today by 3 speakers, all with names that start with the letter J, and I'd like to thank them for their time for being with us. First up, we're going to hear from Janos Marton, who's Director of Policy and Campaigns at JustLeadershipUSA, and in that capacity, he manages the campaign to close Rikers in New York. Next, we'll have Janet Kim, who's Communications Director at Caring Across Generations. She's based in New York, but today she's going to be telling us about a campaign they worked on in Hawaii. And finally, we'll have John-Michael Torres, who's Communications Coordinator at LUPE. He's based in San Juan, Texas, which is near McAllen, near the US-Mexico border. So we're going to be taking your questions at the end of the webinar, so feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions box to the right on the GoToWebinar toolbar. And you can join the conversation online by using the hashtag #LocalWinsForUs. That's local wins with the number 4us, or by tweeting at OpAgenda. And oh yeah, after the webinar, there's going to be a short evaluation that will pop up on your screen. Please fill it out so we can make future webinars even better. So first up, we're going to have Janos. Are you there, Janos?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, can you tell us about Rikers? I feel like as New Yorkers, we know a lot about we've heard a lot about the jail, but tell folks on the line what's going on there.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. I'm an Opportunity Agenda Fellow for this year, and I am very thankful for the work and the support they've given, not only to me individually, but to Just Leadership USA as an organization. Just Leadership USA is a national criminal justice advocacy organization based in Harlem that seeks to cut the US correctional population in half by 2030 and empower the voices of formerly incarcerated people. And our largest campaign is the Close Rikers campaign here in New York City. So I will start with a little bit of background for folks who aren't from New York about what Rikers is. And in fact, this is helpful, I think, for people who are from New York as well. So if you go to the next slide, or the next slide after that, there you go. Yeah. So Rikers Island is 420 acres, 420-acre jail complex located right off the coast of the city next to LaGuardia Airport. So one of the many flaws about it, you know, for 8 decades, it's been a place of violence and corruption and torture. But because of its location, it's out of sight and out of mind. It's where we send New Yorkers for pre-trial detention so that we don't have to acknowledge the problem of mass incarceration. And so while there have been these scandals that have gone on for year after year since the facilities first opened in 1935, very often there are very few New Yorkers who personally interact with this space and understand the horrors of what go on there. So we launched, so Rikers Island, like I said, has been plagued with violence and corruption since it opened 80 years ago. There are about 10,000 people who are at Rikers Island on a given day. 80% of them have not yet been convicted of a crime. 89% are Black or Latino, and it costs New Yorkers $270,000 per bed per year to keep Rikers open. So as a campaign, when we launched in April of 2016, our mission was not only to shutter Rikers Island, but to significantly reduce the number of New Yorkers who wind up there every day, who wind up going through across that bridge every year. And how we do that is through a variety of policy reforms, including bail reform, speedy trial, expanded access to alternatives, but even more importantly than that, shifting the culture narrative around who we lock up and why. For many New Yorkers, they assume the worst folks at Rikers Island, and that's partly because of portrayals in media and such like, media and news reports, but the fact of the matter is most of the people who are at Rikers Island are there because they're simply too poor to pay bail. So as you heard from my very brief summary of what the campaign is, we very much rely on the VPSA approach that Opportunity Agenda recommends that advocacy organizations use: value, problem, solution, action. It's central to the campaign to understand the values of New Yorkers being out of step with what's happening at Rikers, understanding how deep the problem is, understanding that the solutions really are at our fingertips at a policy level, and encouraging New Yorkers to join the campaign. So if you look at this slide and the previous one, we did a lot of the things that a campaign would traditionally do. We organized people most directly impacted and elevated them into leadership. We created a big grass tops coalition of 170 organizations. We put on big marches. The first slide that you saw just before this one is we marched about 1,000 people through Astoria, Queens to the foot of the Rikers Bridge and held a major demonstration right by the entrance to Rikers, which created really dramatic visual optics as well as emotional ones. The next slide you see is from a vigil we did outside of Gracie Mansion, which is where the mayor lives. And this was in the dead of winter, and it was going to be hard to get good shots in the dark, and so we worked with ACT TV, who many of you may have worked with before, to create this visual, which allowed the event to really travel across social media very effectively. If I could see the next slide. So I could spend an entire hour talking about just the campaign strategy, but this is obviously a communications-focused just conversation. You can do marches and you can do rallies, but those are very labor-intensive, time, and even financially expensive endeavors. So we always were looking for ways that we can insert Rikers Island into the conversation, ways that will get publicity and news attention, but not overwhelm our campaign team. And so one of the ways we do that is by bird dogging, which is showing up wherever your principal is to confront them directly. And so when Mayor de Blasio was running for re-election, we would show up at his fundraisers, at his town halls. And this picture, you see one of our leaders, Darren Mack, approaching him at his local YMCA. He's doing yoga in cargo shorts on the gym floor over there. And, this is a big tradition the mayor has of going to this Friday morning workout, and he claims so he can be connected to regular New Yorkers. And so we got one of our members leaders a gift membership so that he could approach the mayor and ask him whether he'd read the report calling for Rikers closure and hand it to him. And this photo and the video that we took of it as well got a lot of media traction. Unfortunately, I think some of the media focus went to the mayor's use of cargo shorts for working out, but they did also cover the substantive issue behind it. Next slide, please. So, like I said, it's always easier to insert yourself into a conversation that's already happening if you want to get attention than try to completely generate your own. And so this summer, when the Confederates Monument conversation was really gripping the entire country, we had already done a lot of research on the history of Rikers Island as part of our campaign. And one of the more scalding facts about Rikers is that even the island's name itself is for a man named Richard Riker. And so he was a New Yorker from the early 19th century who was a judge and part of a group called the Kidnapping Club, who would kidnap black men and hold show trials for them and then sell them back to the southern plantation owner from whom they had likely fled, or in some cases, not even that plantation owner. And so Richard Riker is a particularly notorious figure in New York history, even beyond being a simple slave owner. He was a slave catcher. And so we created this graphic around the time of the Confederate Monument debate, and not only circulated social media, but it had an action at Rikers Island that drew attention to the history of slavery that was central to the island's naming. Next slide, please. So, this photo I love because it captures one of our best leaders in action. This is a woman whose son spent 6 years on Rikers Island. I want to include in this presentation because this may sound so intuitive that people roll their eyes, but compared to other campaigns I've worked on, at Just Leadership, we take photography very seriously. We always make sure we have either somebody on staff or a volunteer who is a really strong photographer working all of our events. In the rare situations where we haven't had such a person available pro bono, we've even taken the expense to pay for it, because these days so much of what happens in getting your message out has to be on social media or email blasts to your members or things like that, not counting on traditional news outlets to cover it. And so I like this particularly fierce picture of Anna, one of our leaders. But this is, we have action shots like this from all of our events, big and small, and it allows us to get a really powerful message out there, even if maybe we didn't get a lot of traditional news coverage that day. Next slide, please. So this is a picture taken from one of our rallies at City Hall. I shouldn't bury the lead. You know, the campaign to close Rikers is a success story in the age of Trump, because even though we launched only in April of 2016, a year later we convinced our principal target, the mayor, to change his position on closing Rikers. While he originally dismissed the campaign as naive and idealistic and too complicated, on March 31st, 2017, he announced that closing Rikers would become the policy of the city of New York. And so that was a major victory for us. It's a victory for the movement. But the campaign is far from over. Among other things, we need to make sure that he actually follows through on his promise, and that not only he but other actors follow through on the things that need to happen to significantly reduce the number of people in jail in New York City. And that originally presented something of a messaging challenge for us, because we technically, you know, won the campaign. But obviously Rikers remains open and there are many people suffering there. And it was actually our members who brainstormed just the phrase 10 years sucks, referring to the mayor's 10-year at least plan to close Rikers. And it's pithy and almost juvenile, but it's just also very clear that, you know, are you guys happy with what the mayor is doing? Well, we're happy that he announced that closing Rikers is city policy, but we think that 10 years sucks. We think that it can be closed a lot faster if the mayor does X, Y, and Z. And so that's why I wanted to highlight this slide to show that, you know, even as the campaign evolves, you know, we were very heavily using hashtags throughout the campaign. Hashtag Close Rikers is in fact the name of the campaign. But as the campaign evolves, we like to use different messaging tools to reflect the current moment that we're in. So I know I'm close to being at time. Will, are there any questions that you think I should address?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I failed to mention at the beginning was saying that one of the reasons we look at these local wins is like, what can people learn from it? You know, so even for folks that are listening who are in the webinar, like that don't necessarily work on criminal justice issues, what do you think are the lessons that you can take away from this that others can use to replicate?
Sure. So I think we try to have as many creative elements to our campaign as possible. That's not at the substitute of doing the conventional things that every campaign organizer knows you have to do in terms of building membership and writing op-eds and meeting with legislators. Like, we did all of those things, but we spent a lot of time, you know, in brainstorming sessions trying to figure out how can we penetrate the consciousness of people around an issue that, frankly, you know, people often find depressing, right? Talking about criminal justice and mass incarceration. And so using powerful imagery, using social media, trying to come up with really good graphics. I didn't include in this presentation, but we did a number of Twitter chats with influencers that sort of got outside the usual bubble. The Confederate action being an example of a sort of off the beaten path way of bringing attention to our issue. So I would just say that, you know, it's not an either or. You know, every campaign needs to do what they need to do in terms of building momentum and doing their homework on the issues. But we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we talk about this issue creatively, especially so that we can keep getting coverage of these issues, even as the story hasn't fundamentally changed month to month and media would otherwise move on. But how do we reinsert this story into the conversation?
Okay, great, thank you. I mean, yeah, it's an amazing achievement. It just, you know, for most New Yorkers, it seems inconceivable what y'all were able to bring about, even though we're still working on it. Mm-hmm. So, but thank you for that. So yeah, if folks have questions for Janos, you know, I encourage you now to go and type a question in the question box to the right in the control panel. But in the meantime, I want to move over to Janet. Janet, you're with Caring Across Generations. So you're based in New York. So did you get to go to Hawaii for this campaign?
Unfortunately, that is a point of jealousy amongst staff. We all wish we could find an excuse to go to Hawaii. Amazingly, I did not go to Hawaii. I will go to Hawaii in a completely personal capacity, but all politics are local, so we really leveraged working with our local partners and local organizers and local media and communications consultants to make this campaign like really resonate in a way that's authentic. So unfortunately, no.
Yeah. Okay. Well, You have that to look forward to. So can you tell us about how you worked with Hawaii's island culture to help you with messaging for this campaign?
Sure. I thought it might be helpful just to ground people in who Caring Across Generations is. In case y'all don't know, we're actually a national campaign that's working to transform how we care for our families, really at every stage of life, but focusing on elder care. And we really grew out of the movement for domestic workers, and we're anchored by the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Jobs with Justice. And in the experiences of the 2 million home care aides in this country right now, many of whom are women of color and immigrants who care for our loved ones who are aging or who have a disability. And even though they're doing this essential, really priceless work, they're making poverty wages with little job protections and maybe some respect in word, but like not in practice. And on the flip side, on the side of people receiving care, most people actually, as they get older, want to stay in their homes for as long as possible. But access to that kind of quality home care is abominably expensive. Like nursing home care ranges around $80,000, $90,000 on average a year. Our policies are biased towards sending you to an institution, and the quality is really low. And the family caregivers who are doing this work, again, mostly women, and in this case, not being paid at all. This work is wholly unaccounted for in the economy. So like you look at both sides, and it feels like a status quo that's not working for anyone. But our co-directors, Aijen Poo and Sarita Gupta, really saw this challenge as also an opportunity in this time when we're seeing like this huge demographic shift where our population is aging at a rate we've never seen, and so the need for care is surging. So it's like, we took a step back, and it's like, how can you look at this system that seems to not make sense in pitting us against one another, but instead, break it down so that we're investing in these caregiving relationships. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to sit here that at our core, we are grounded in relationships because care is a relational activity. And so, we've been around for 6 years, and throughout that time have worked in anywhere from 8 to sometimes up to 15 states with local partners on the ground, looking at local policies, but also culture shifting work, because we know that for any of the policies we fight for to take root, we have to make caregiving work and the people who are doing this work more visible and valued, and also shift from this notion where like care is such a private individual burden to a collective responsibility, therefore demanding a public solution. And so one of the earliest states that we worked in was Hawaii, and I'm gonna kind of just let the cat out of the bag and tell you like the reason why I'm on this call is because this past summer in July, we achieved a really big win in passing the first law of its kind to provide a benefit to working family caregivers to help care for their families. So it's called the Kupuna Caregivers Program. And in short, it provides a voucher for up to $70 a day. It'll cover pay for a home care aide, transportation to adult daycare, or to hire someone that can help with cooking and cleaning and bathing and other long-term care activities. And this win really reflected a multi-year effort, one that started pre-Trump, and one that started before Caring Across even existed. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just tell you a little bit about why Hawaii. Hawaii had been working on long-term care long before we went there, and really dates back to their history as being like advanced in the healthcare world generally, being really progressive on healthcare even before the Affordable Care Act. And it's a state with the highest life expectancy. And they had actually already commissioned a state study assessing the need and the cost of long-term care and seeing what it would take to make universal social insurance possible. So it's like Social Security where everybody's paying in and everyone's benefiting. And so naturally, this felt like a great place for us to dig in, also because culturally, you know, there's a strong sense of caring for one's kupuna, which is the term that Hawaiians use to describe their elders, and that care should take place at home. And so, you know, we've been organizing with local partners since 2013, and finally in 2016, we felt like it was a breakthrough year. Nationally, I think maybe we felt that way, hopefully. Locally, we did too, in actually pushing forward for this universal long-term care insurance. Some challenges though, because the downside to this being such a well-known issue and the groundwork being laid down was the environment felt a little bit stagnant. People had heard a lot about this need, and I think just assumed that nothing would ever get done because nothing had gotten done for years. And then we're competing for revenue with another huge rail infrastructure project that had already begun and needed increased budgets, and they were behind. So ultimately in 2016, like, even though we did all the traditional things, we lobbied more than 3/4 of the state legislature, we had lobby days, we got some media coverage, though not a ton, mostly focused on the ground game. The bill actually stalled in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So then now we're in, so that stalls, and then, you know, the national environment becomes what it is, and you have Trump in office. And I think there was a moment of like, oh, excuse my language and say, oh shit, but like, what are we gonna do, you know? And I think it forced us to take a step back, reflect, but then stay committed, be nimble, but also stay committed to our long-term vision. And so going to the next slide, I usually actually use this in comms presentations to make that very basic point about framing, how important the frame is. And when you're using a message, and a lot of people actually describe the aging of our population as a silver tsunami, which is horrendous because a tsunami is a natural disaster. It's like something you want to run away from, not necessarily embrace. I thought this image also kind of captured, though, like maybe in this moment we had to think quickly and respond very nimbly, and ultimately we changed our demand, and we're okay with it, and went for a less ambitious but still breakthrough policy, where instead of having a universal social insurance program, we're going to go for this more scaled back benefit for working family caregivers. What that meant on the narrative side was shifting our messaging to what this really means for women and caregivers and what this means for the economy, but sticking with that really aspirational sense that this is a breakthrough program. And I think that actually appealed to a whole new constituency that we might not have reached the year before in focusing on seniors and people receiving care. Another very basic communications best practice is leading with values and leading with people. And I think we can very much attribute our success to sticking to that. So on the next slide, you know, when you think about care, like similarly, you know, it can be a very depressing subject that you want to avoid. And if you think about like the stress and the costs and the injustice and lead with that, you kind of like stop the conversation before it starts. And we really found that framing it in and grounding it in this cultural sense of caring for one's kupuna, and that was our campaign name, and appealing to Hawaiian pride, and this is like what we do for one another in Hawaii, and we're kind of like out of, you know, we're not afraid to kind of break from the mainstream and the mainland, was really helpful, and always leading with that. And I think especially, you know, at the beginning of this year when the fight or the attacks against the ACA were so strong and that was dominating the national conversation, it was a really empowering, hopeful counterpoint to make at the local level, like, well, okay, that's going on, but we can still realize what we believe in here and what our communities need, which hasn't changed, and actually, you know, push forward with solutions. So appealing to those values, and then, you know, working with members to do all the great things that y'all do, getting spokespeople, leading with stories. We had a very robust paid media and earned media campaign. We produced our own video content. At the national level, you know, we helped with digital outreach and setting up the campaign site and really mobilizing people in a very clear way throughout the legislative process, creating drama where you don't really think drama exists in a legislative process. So we had the op-eds, the newspaper editorials, and also a range of voices in this, because care affects everyone. So we had health professionals, seniors and caregivers, small business owners, clergy leaders, and elected officials, huge media blitz. And then if you go to the next slide, also was really mindful about when it would be strategic to support this media outreach at the national level. The worst thing, you know, we didn't want to look like an outside group pushing a national agenda. But at times it was helpful as leverage points, especially for local elected officials, for them to feel like this was not just a big deal locally, but this was a really big deal nationally. And so, you know, the local media game was really strong, but at key points, we also made it a point to do some national media outreach. And at first, the bites were small. We had like a NBC Asia America online piece, but then that then led to an MSNBC interview with the governor, which I think, you know, raised the stakes in his own accountability to the success of the program. And so this is just kind of snowballing. Now we have an opportunity with the New York Times, and even with this small program, it's opened the doors to new opportunities I don't think we could have imagined, and some benefits to not going, or, you know, not leading with the full-blown universal social insurance program. Now we're looking at really great ways of maybe experimenting with the implementation and rollout of the program that could inform, hopefully, a national solution. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're going to work towards and fight for, is a national solution. But it's really great to have this local light of a model for inspiration. So I'll stop there. I think I'm going over. Sorry, Will. If you have any questions, let me know.
Oh, no, that was great. Thank you. I guess my question again is similar to what I was asking Janos, is like, what do you think others can learn from this, particularly when they're working in states, or they're working on campaigns that are not in their own states?
Yeah, I think you need to really trust your local people and always lead with the people closest to the problem. And I think that would be my takeaway in terms of working remotely, and keeping the feedback loops like really live and immediate and current. But otherwise, just, you know, having that trust. I would say also, it's always good to fight the inertia. Like, even if you think that things might be stalling, like, I was really heartened that we could stick with it. And again, like, keep the door open to new opportunities that we couldn't have even predicted, even though maybe this wasn't, you know, our original goal or our original vision for a win.
That's great. Well, congratulations on that work. So if folks that are on the webinar have questions for Janet, you know, you can type them in the question box to the right, or you can tweet them at us with local wins for us, and we'll be circle back with questions at the end of this. Next up, we have John-Michael. And John-Michael, I'm just, you know, could you tell us more about Hidalgo County, like where you are in Texas? Is it as polarized as the rest of the United States?
So the Rio Grande Valley is a small but growing region of South Texas along the border. And the vast majority of us are Mexican American and children of immigrants. And we've been really strongly opposed to the border wall for the more than 10 years that it's been proposed. And that's because we really value our friends and neighbors south of the border, south of the river. And so for as long as the border wall has been an idea, our communities have really, we care about our communities, and we don't want to see our communities divided by the wall. And our area also is a very blue region in a very red state. So we are represented in Congress by Democrats. But if you go to other parts of the border that are represented by Republicans, even Republican members of Congress, to varying degrees, have concerns about the border wall. So we really do see a border-wide opposition to the border wall, and that's what I'll be talking about today. And really, what I'll be talking about, I should mention, is work from lots of different organizations, and not even just organizations, but individuals who are really animated around this issue of not wanting to see border walls through our communities.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there's a difference between a border wall and a border fence, and I'm just curious, like, why that was an important distinction to make or not make in your campaign.
Yeah, so from the beginning of this new administration, well, really during the campaign, Trump's campaign, the idea of a big, monstrous, standalone slab of concrete is what a lot of people are equating with border wall. And we saw pretty early on in the new administration that even Democrats, key Democrats and Democratic leadership were also had this misconception. And they were at different points, different key points, pretty much saying that, you know what, we're opposed to border walls, but border fencing is okay. But the problem is that border fencing is walls. So if you can see on your screen on the left, these are different types of what are sometimes referred to as fencing, even though they are border walls. You have on the left the bollard fencing. We have a lot of that already from the last time around here in the Rio Grande Valley. And then on the right, you see the mesh fencing. And there are different forms that the border wall takes. And there are other forms as well besides these. And all of them are disastrous. And we wanted to make sure that no more border walls are constructed along the border. And so what we saw really was that the opportunity for that was going to be in the funds for the government. The administration can't really do a whole lot more than what it is doing right now in different areas without more funds. And so the process for the budget negotiations between Democrats and Republicans, between the administration and Congress, was where we had leverage. So Trump needs more money to build the wall, and that's primarily where we can stop him. And we knew this was an opportunity because the Obamacare, the divisions in the Republican Party over Obamacare were really playing out at a national stage. We knew that there were already divisions within the Republican Party on the border wall because there are border members of Congress, Republican members of Congress that are not so keen on the idea. So what we did was we crafted a message that really was the idea was that if we can maintain democratic unity, the divisions in the Republican Party are going to allow us to stop these funds from moving forward. And only if border communities could remain unified against the wall can we give Democrats strength to stand united. Because if our unity falters, then that gives them permission to falter as well. So what that meant for us was that we needed to get our city officials and members of Congress along the border to come out publicly, vocally opposing the wall. But we also needed to make sure that they were saying, and that we were saying, that we are against the wall in all forms that it takes, because we couldn't let that misconception allow them to negotiate away our communities. So we had to do a couple of different things. At the national level, we had to make sure that the Democratic leadership, who in many ways are the ones who are at the table when the negotiations around funding the government happen, we needed to make sure that they understood that they should be, when they say they're against border walls, that they should be against all forms of border walls. So we worked with organizations across the border, reaching out to Democratic leadership, also members of Congress, specifically Democratic members of Congress from the border, reaching out to Democratic leadership and educating them on the different forms that the wall takes. And then at the local level, communities mobilizing to pass resolutions in their cities. So again, this was something that was a widespread effort, and folks in different cities would reach out to their cities to make sure that they passed a resolution that not only was against the border wall, but as much as possible that stated clearly that they were against all forms of border wall. And so this really, what this did was it created a wave of opposition to the border wall that was very visible, and that thankfully was able to reach Democratic leadership. And if you can go on to the next slide,
Sure.
Sorry.
This
one of the examples that we had of the different actions that we did in order to demonstrate the widespread opposition. And this was here in my town, Mission, Texas. We had mobilization where we brought around 700 people to the border to say that we reject walls in our communities.
And so how does this issue of the border wall connect to larger immigration things, like, what's going on with DACA and stuff?
So when DACA was rescinded, that was really the point when Democratic leadership had to state their position, right? Democratic leadership their immediate response to the taking away of DACA was to ask what they could negotiate in exchange for protections for DACA recipients, Dreamers. And so if there was any kind of wavering on the part of Democratic leadership about their opposition to the wall or allowing different forms of the wall to be funded, then that was really where we were going to see it. So the good news was that the Democratic leadership said very loudly, boldly, strongly, no wall in exchange for a DACA fix. And they assured us that that also includes all forms of border wall. Now, the not so good news is that Democratic leadership is considering other forms of border militarization in exchange for DACA. And what this really shows is that that our work in a lot of ways is to communicate the needs of border residents, the reality of border residents to people who are not along the border, who are but making decisions about that affect border communities. And this idea that we need more border militarization, more boots on the ground, more technology, is an idea that really is coming from, these narratives that are being produced in order to gain more votes, really by right-wing politicians. And so a lot of our work is to get that reality out there, to make sure that border voices are heard, because when there are decisions that are made about our communities, really our voices need to be taken into account when those decisions are made.
Great. Thank you for the work you're doing. It sounds like you've made a lot of traction there. I wanted to open it up now to questions from folks on the webinar. If you wanted to type in your questions or tweet them to us. But I guess I'll go ahead and ask another question I had for all of our speakers. How can you keep campaign momentum going when it seems like politicians just want to use it almost as a photo op for posturing and to make themselves look good, but without actually doing anything for real change? Would y'all have any responses for that?
Sure, I'm happy to respond. Again, this is Janos from speaking about the Close Rikers campaign. So because our target was Mayor de Blasio, it was naturally easy for rivals and opponents of the mayor to seize on our talking points and our issue as a way to knock him down a peg and boost themselves, whether or not they were necessarily sincere about working with us. And we were aware of that and always took any endorsements or support from such people with a big grain of salt, knowing that they had additional incentives to do that. But I think for what we've tried to do is wait for the right moment to pivot the accountability towards those individuals. So for example, here in New York, there are a number of reforms to the criminal justice system that require state action. So we were happy to let the governor beat up on the mayor for several months, calling him ineffectual and slow for not calling for the closing of Rikers or not calling for its closure fast enough. But once we were prepared for it, we launched a campaign that's focused exclusively on state legislative action, where the governor is in fact the principal target, called Free New York. And we're connecting the Close Rikers and Free New York campaigns among our members and partners in the media to squarely put a specific aspect of the campaign at the governor's doorstep. And having already publicly committed to closing Rikers, we feel that we can exact some leverage on the governor in this case. So I would say that politicians will always try to play off each other and capitalize on the momentum of advocates, but as long as you know what your specific ask is of all the players, springing that on them at the right time is, I think, the best way to go.
That's great. Janet and John-Michael, do you have anything to add to that about politicians posturing?
No, I think that's right. I think timing really matters, and for us, it's the carrot is useful to then, keep on our folks for accountability. But I think the timing definitely matters.
I would just add that in a campaign that was really asking our local officials to stand up and not to be, to have a very clear position against the border wall, folks from their cities being present, whether it's in the city commission meetings or through the media, through their work with the media, really making sure that that they were hearing this from their constituents was a really good way of making sure that, if they did start to equivocate, if they did start to vary in their position, that they would hear from their constituents right away.
Yeah, no, it's true. And Janet, you're talking about timing. Do you think in general, there's an importance to continuing to fight for things rather than constantly resisting? Because we hear the word resist a lot, but it sounds like y'all had very proactive things you wanted to see happen.
Yeah, I think we all have different issues we're working on, and I think day to day and understanding of the different roles we can play in solidarity ultimately. But I think in this moment it can be helpful, especially you opened the call by mentioning the onslaught of negativity day after day that I think folks are still kind of yearning for, and maybe even for a reprieve from that onslaught, and just keeping in mind, well, what is it that we ultimately want, and having a clear picture of that, being able to articulate it, and like we're doing on this call, celebrating the bits of momentum that we're achieving together where we can, so that one win builds upon another. But I think being able to name what it is we're fighting for, so that we can go even harder against what's being attacked, is important.
Very good point. And John-Michael, so your messaging was really targeted at folks locally, but how do you think how do you think groups should do as far as like adjusting their messaging for local versus national audiences?
Well, what I think that was important for us to recognize is that our local voices were really what was giving giving Democrats in Congress a lot of strength, because when they could say, you know, in their negotiations, whether it's to party leadership or across the aisle, when they could say that border residents don't want this, then why should we be doing this? That really did give a lot of strength in in those conversations that you know, we weren't a part of those conversations, but they could draw on the work that we were doing, the visibility that we were creating, in order to say, you know what, this is something that we shouldn't be moving forward with.
That's a good point. We have a question from someone on the webinar. The question is about how much change do you expect to see in using research to assist progressive policy and political action in the next 5 years? Like, what role does research play in your work? Anybody have an answer for that?
I mean, I can take a stab at it. You know, there's no doubt that having really good research on this issue has been helpful to us, especially because of the bold demand that we were making. Well, I think you pointed out the skepticism that many rightly had when we started our campaign, that what we were asking for seemed like so crazy in the context of New York City's fraught history on criminal justice. But we were able to march into the conversation with a lot of data, almost none of which, you know, was our own research, that really made the case. I mean, when I say, you know, $270,000 per bed per year, that's just a jarring figure that comes from the comptroller's office, but he was pushed to do it because of a Vera Institute report that came out last year. So that's something that really paints a compelling picture and helps us in our messaging. And so I certainly think that there's certainly a lot of research on things like bail and speedy trial and how successful certain diversion programs are that make our messaging possible when we're in a room with skeptical people.
Good point. Janet or John-Michael, do you have anything to add to that about the role of research?
I would add that. Really, go ahead.
I'll go. I was going to say it's really important for us, and unfortunately, in the home care industry, there's very little research because of home care's status in the world of medicine at large. And you know, there's not a lot of scientifically reliable data, like for instance, linking access to home care to improved health outcomes. And even when it comes to saving the healthcare system money, it's not up to the research that's out there is not quite up to par. So at the national level, as we're moving forward and trying to develop policy, we're grounding it in research first, and that's what we're investing in. And then with the rollout in Hawaii, because it is like a little bit smaller scale, we definitely want to pair that with a really rigorous evaluation and assessment on how this is impacting people's lives. I think that's what you're talking about in talking about research as opposed to communications research, but I'll stop there.
Okay.
I would just add that, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'll just add that when we're talking about divisions in the Republican Party, it's very useful to be able to give the Republicans that are, you know, that are more towards our side of the issue some more ammo in their discussions with the members of their own party. So even though research hasn't played a big role in our communications aspect of our organizing, it has been important to get into the hands of members of Congress so they can say, hey, you know what, look at this. This is a reason why we shouldn't be thinking about this, or this is a reason why we shouldn't be gung-ho about moving forward with this. Here are the numbers, and my constituents are telling me they don't want this either.
Yeah, and I agree with all y'all are saying, but I also think, you know, as you pointed out in all your presentations, that values-based messaging also goes a long way too, and that's what was a key part of a lot of what you achieved, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it depends on the audience. Are you talking about like the general public It's kind of the elected officials and the influencers who need those numbers and the proof points.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, yeah, I think, you know, y'all have done a great job today, really giving us hope during the age of Trump, and knowing that folks can really make progressive change at the local level. And I think, you know, all of what you've achieved is really amazing, and really is a testament to the rest of us to learn how to do successful campaigns during this challenging time. And so I just want to thank Janos, Janet, and John-Michael again for sharing their knowledge with us today. If you have any questions, what we've talked about, please connect with me or Elizabeth Johnson. And we're also going to be sending a recording as a follow-up, a recording of this webinar to you afterwards, so you can share with any of your colleagues who couldn't make it to the webinar today. And as you close out of GoToWebinar, there's going to be a short evaluation that will pop up. And if you could just please fill it out, that will make sure that we're offering the best possible webinars for folks in the future. So thanks again to our speakers, and thanks to all of y'all that joined the call. And we'll look forward to you speaking to you again. Thanks a lot. Bye.